From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and coming up today, K-State's Dan O'Brien covering the latest developments in the grain markets, including the market volatility created by Russia's invasion of Ukraine this week. And Dan sizes up the USDA's projection on U.S. crop production and prices in 2022, part of that Agricultural Outlook Forum yesterday. Also, K-State's Sarah Lancaster will talk about planning the termination of a cover crop ahead of spring planting, either mechanically or by way of a herbicide treatment. She'll go over the herbicide alternatives for this purpose, relating to the kind of cover crop to be taken out. And on Kansas agricultural weather, K-State's Chip Redmond is ahead on this Agriculture Today. You are tuned in to Agriculture Today. We appreciate you being along with us as we take up the grain markets, which are riding the wave of geopolitics, and now a new USDA account of crop production, the department's forecast in its Agricultural Outlook Forum for 2022, just posted yesterday morning. Dan O'Brien is along with us via phone, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension. What we'll share as far as the new USDA numbers, Dan, do fall upon the backdrop of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that is topping the thoughts of virtually all markets at the moment.
Yes, we saw initial moves that were really quite strong in the corn market, up to limit levels, but then since then have backed off. The wheat market jumped up 50-cent gains, and we'll see in coming days where the market finally decides to settle itself at. But clearly, between corn, soybean, and hard red winter wheat futures, the market that I guess is the home of the most concern would be in the wheat market, and that would tie in, of course, with the strength of Black Sea wheat region exports and their predominance in world wheat markets. So Chicago wheat up strong, soft red winter wheat up strong, hard red winter wheat out of Chicago also up strong, spring wheat up somewhat, not still up pretty strongly, but not near as high relatively speaking as those other two.
Well, without a doubt, it's to be a wild run ahead for the markets in the wake of that turmoil in the Black Sea region. All market participants best hang on. As for the more foundational, if you will, Dan, the USDA's Ag Outlook Forum numbers, walk through those, if you would, and what you think they're saying to the grain trades.
You know, when we look at the first, I guess, from the USDA side, we were really wondering about what the USDA would say for acreage, particularly for corn and soybeans. They came out and projected a decrease of corn acres from 93.4 million last year down to 92 projected for this year. And that's in line with what the markets were generally. Well, an overall market survey that came out a day ahead of the USDA numbers, that's almost exactly in line with what they had thought. If anything, and just a little bit more than some. But on the soybean side, they had an increase. The USDA projected 88 million acres, up from 87.2, and actually that's not as much as the overall market was thinking that soybean acres would go up. They're thinking more like 2 million acres. I think they were projecting 89.2 instead of 87.2, relative to the current year. So 89.2 in terms of what the market was thinking versus 88 million acres and relative to what the USDA was saying. Also, for wheat, there's a real question here about spring wheat acres. Now, the USDA projected an increase in U.S. wheat acres of from 46.7 up to 48, but yet we receive reports up in the spring wheat areas of low seed sales for hard red spring wheat, questions about what prospects are up in that part of the world, particularly relative to competitive crops up in the Dakotas and those northern areas. So I think out of all these numbers that we see in terms of the production prospects, probably the one I would wonder on the lowness of the USDA's projection of soybean acres, and also put a question mark and a need for reexamination in coming months of where the spring wheat acres are going to finally work themselves out at here in 2022.
Acreage numbers in, that's how the USDA portrays those. But of equal interest, of course, would be USDA's projections on yields for the coming production season. You see some things there, you say, that you wonder about.
The USDA in this report and in past Outlook conference reports basically takes trend line yields, they overtly state, and they state it right up front, that they're assuming normal planting conditions and summer crop development that is not stressful to the crop. So I understand that. They've come in, particularly on corn, and projected a yield of 181 bushels an acre. And yes, it's possible to get that with yield improvements, et cetera, but I just would hold out the question of how, with tight fertilizer supplies this year on sky-high prices, if we have applied as much fertilizer and or seed, because seed's pretty expensive as well, if we're really accounting for some of the marginal factor cost issues, marginal return issues that applying these inputs will have to deal with this year. So I would wonder about the 181 bushels per acre that the USDA has put out for this, and you could come in and say 175 bushels per acre, given these fertilizer and seed issues, and could justify it just as well as the 181, I think. So anyway, by the time you look at that, their projection is for just under 2 billion bushels ending stocks for corn, and an average price of $5 a bushel, which basically would be a major change in market scope from where we're at right now. As we talk, we're looking at December corn futures prices well over $6. And so if we're going to have a $5 season average price for the 2022-23 corn crop, then you'd be looking at about at least a $1 drop in futures from where they're at right now. That's sure possible, but given the strength we have right now, that's something that you'd wonder about.
Seems to be the worst case scenario if you look at it. Soybeans, their yield forecast just above 51 bushels per acre. Your take on that, Dan?
Probably more attainable than the 181 for corn. Again, 51.5, 51.5 bushels an acre. We were at 51.4 last year, 51 the year before that. 2019-20, we were at 47.4 bushels per acre. So the 51.5 is still on the upper side of where we've been of late. So let's say that's attained. You end up, even with that, the USDA has placed in there their expectation that exports will be stronger in the coming year than they were this year. We're looking at current projection of about 2.050 billion bushels of exports there, coming in at 100 million higher than that, at 2.15. And with that, by the time you put all these factors together, they're projecting a little tighter ending stocks to 305 million bushels in stocks to use, about 6.7%, a price of $12.75, and again, you're at $12.75 for a season average price in the next marketing year. You compare that to where November 22 futures are at right now, which is somewhere at $14.50 to $15. And again, to make that happen, you're looking at a $2 decline, approximately about a $2 decline in soybean futures from where they're at right now. So the USDA has followed their normal pattern on these things, and they've projected conservatively for prices. I think that's sort of their DNA right now, coming out of the Outlook conferences. So we take these numbers. They are the first marker laid down. We'll look at them, et cetera. But I almost think that there's so much more right now to deal with in terms of geopolitical impacts on trade and overall markets, and both financial and commodities, that I think we'll take out of what the USDA has said. We'll look at the acreage numbers in particular, and then we'll work our way forward in terms of both of usage and price prospects as we go on down the road. I would say the next numbers that are coming out for the USDA will be the March 31st acreage numbers, basically a prospective plantings report. And from that, then, the USDA will come back to these same supply-demand tables. They'll reapproach them in the May 12th WASDE reports, World Ag Supply-Demand Estimates. So now we've got the USDA numbers laid down. We'll see where we go from here.
And quickly here to squeeze in the USDA projecting a $6.80 per bushel average price for wheat. Is that also to your thinking on the conservative side?
Well, right now, July wheat for hard red winter, $9.63, so $6.80 is about almost a $3 drop. So it'll take a major change in the markets to see that happen. And I think, Eric, you've touched on it, probably the most in question number out of the USDA's projections would be that wheat price, particularly with all the challenges and probably further sanctions that could occur, that could gum up, could slow down the ability of Russia to export grain. If that happens, then you would wonder about where U.S. wheat prices and U.S. wheat export prospects could go. And it would seem that the 680 right now is pretty conservative relative to where the, again, a 950 to 975 July wheat futures contract price is at.
Well, we are heading into uncertain territory with what has happened in the Russia-Ukraine situation and how that's resonating throughout so many parts of our economy, including the grain markets. We'd invite you to stay up on what's happening in Dan's series of notes on the grain trades. He does post those each week at agmanager.info. The latest edition is there for you now. And Dan, thank you. Take care. We'll talk again next week.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
That's Dan O'Brien, grain market economist with K-State Research and Extension. He's along with us every Friday to talk grain market trends here on Agriculture Today. When we return, some management information for those of you with cover crops out on your crop ground this winter, and the best ways of clearing those out for cash crop planting this spring. That's next on the K-State Radio Network. We're back now on This Agriculture Today. We've had more than a few occasions to talk about the interest in planting cover crops for a variety of soil management and crop systems management reasons. That's taken off here in Kansas. But for those who will be utilizing that ground for a cash crop this spring, you need to be thinking in terms of how you'll terminate an existing cover crop in advance of that, and that's what we'll take up right here. Joining us once again is weed management specialist Sarah Lancaster of K-State Research and Extension. Now is the time, Sarah, you say, for producers to be thinking about the method they'll go about when they bring those cover crops to an end.
That's right, Eric. Cover crop termination is something we won't practically be doing in the field probably for a while yet until we get a little closer to planting. But it's definitely time to start making those preparations and getting things in order to terminate those cover crops.
Before we talk about the general methods of doing away with a cover crop, a thought or two on the dry conditions we've had in Kansas over the winter. For those who planted a winter annual as a cover crop here last fall, the question arises, did that cover crop even survive our harsher conditions, cold and dry?
Yeah, so, one of the least expensive ways to terminate a cover crop is to choose a species that's likely to winter kill. So typically that's going to be things like oats or maybe winter peas, things that are just a little less cold hardy. So that's definitely one thing for folks to consider. Maybe it's obviously too late for that crop selection for this year, but as they go forward. The other thing is I talk to folks out and about and I look at my research plots. We've had a pretty dry fall. So things like cereal rye that we normally think would come out and get some pretty good biomass in the fall are, if they were planted, late at all, they don't have the biomass yet quite that we want in order to secure both the soil health benefits and the weed suppression benefits from those cover crops.
So can one simply count on winter kill taking out these cover crops or need to be thinking in terms of other approaches here?
Something like a cereal rye, even if it had poor growth in the fall, if we get our spring rains, it's going to, in all likelihood, going to come on and going to need to be terminated either with mechanical termination or some sort of chemical termination as you get closer to planting and get some more biomass on that cover crop.
Don't count on that automatic termination here. You'll have to take steps. And those are the two approaches here, mechanical or chemical means of terminating a cover crop. Let's spend a moment on the mechanical approach and the timing of that, Sarah.
Sure. So mechanical cover crop termination, we generally think about using something called a roller crimper. And basically that implement works by pushing over the stem of that cover crop and breaking the stem. So that means that generally it's going to be more effective on our winter cereals like rye or wheat than it is going to be on things like brassicas or legumes. So if you have a cereal-based cover crop, this is a better option. And the other thing that's important is the timing. So we know that we need a lot of biomass out there in order to really get the benefits of weed suppression and some of the other soil health measures. But we also need to have that cereal rye be pretty mature. So generally speaking, we think about anthesis or flowering as the best time to terminate that cover crop using a roller crimper, because that stem then is rigid enough that when you bend it over with the roller crimper, it'll actually break instead of just folding and springing back up.
The other alternative, then, is chemical control of cover crops, and the alternatives afforded to a producer there. But the hope here is to get that cover crop knocked down swiftly, right?
Right. So there's a couple different approaches to this, Eric. One approach would be to wait and terminate your cover crop, say, a couple of weeks before you plant, and that gives time for that herbicide to really effectively kill that cover crop, and you have dead biomass on the surface that you can then, manage with your planting equipment. The other option that is gaining some popularity, and we've actually done a little bit of research with this in cooperation with some folks out of Wisconsin and some other states, is something called planting green. And so when you do that, you're basically going to plant right into that standing cover crop and use your at-planting herbicide application to terminate that cover crop. So basically saving a pass. It seems to work fairly well for soybeans in areas that get sufficient moisture to work.
Then what chemistry would be best for that approach?
So in general, when we talk cover crop termination, the favored herbicide is, here it comes, glyphosate. Right. Not a big surprise there. But as we think about the situations for 2022, Eric, I think we need to talk a little bit about some alternatives to glyphosate, simply because of the pricing issues with glyphosate this year, as well as the availability issues. We just keep hearing more and more struggles with the availability issues around glyphosate and some other products this year. So things to think about as far as alternatives, Eric, probably the next best choice for terminating a cereal-based cover crop mixture is going to be the grass-killing herbicides in Group 1, so things like Select or Assure. They are effective at controlling grasses. They have a couple of things that folks need to be considering, though, as they're thinking about using them. So one would be the fact that these products don't work very well in cool, cloudy conditions. They just don't move through the plant like we need them to really kill that plant at the growing point. So thinking about choosing your application timing in terms of the weather carefully, making sure you're using good adjuvants and full rates with those products are very important. The other thing to think about with those Group 1 herbicides, if you have a mixed stand of covers and you want to control grasses and broadleaves, we often will throw 2,4-D in the tank with some glyphosate and then, enhance our control of those broadleaves and get really good kill. We don't want to put 2,4-D in the tank with clethodim. You might get away with it, but you're not going to get as good of a kill as you would if you put that clethodim or similar product out by itself. So this is something called antagonism, whereby that 2,4-D reduces the grass control by the Select. So, we can somewhat overcome it by using maximum rates, using ideal adjuvant packages, applying in good weather conditions. But really, there's a lot of literature on antagonism with those Group 1 herbicides from back in the pre-glyphosate years. Really, the only thing in that big data set that consistently prevents antagonism with Group 1 herbicides like Select is to not co-apply them with something like 2,4-D.
Duly noted. Keep that well in mind. How about the other non-selective products beyond glyphosate? One would be paraquat. Would that be a suitable substitute here?
There is some work that shows that paraquat can give us satisfactory control of cover crops. It's not going to be stellar, but it will be satisfactory, especially if you come in and apply it with a Group 5 herbicide, so a photosystem 2 inhibiting herbicide like atrazine or metribuzin. So a couple of things going on there. We see some synergy of the group 5 with the paraquat. So we see increased paraquat activity, and you also get some residual activity that way.
As of yet, we've not mentioned legumes as a cover crop. Does one take an alternate approach here?
Really the most cost-effective way to handle the legumes is going to be something like a 2,4-D or a 2,4-D dicamba mix, especially if it's a single species or there are no grasses in that mix. The paraquat treatments that we just mentioned are actually going to be a little bit better on a lot of our broadleaf crops than they are on the grasses, simply because we have trouble not fully killing the growing point on those grasses. And so those grasses are very likely to regrow if you apply paraquat by itself.
Want to mention also residual herbicide products and their role in this. Where would they fit?
There is definitely a fit for residuals in your cover crop termination. There's been a little bit of work that's already published that says we do see a little bit less herbicide getting to the soil when we apply those residual herbicides over the top of cover crops. The good news about that, though, is that in the published work, there is no negative impacts on weed control. So we still see, so even though we know we're getting weed suppression with those cover crops, we still see better weed control through the early part of the growing season when we put residual herbicides in with the cover crop. Sulfentrazone was the product that was used in the research that I'm thinking of, but we can probably apply that to some other scenarios. The planting green work that I mentioned earlier, we are looking at the role of Zidua as a residual herbicide in that cover crop termination.
There is a website that collects all the information on various herbicide options for this purpose.
Yeah, so one of the things that the extension specialists in the soybean producing states have been working on for a number of years is a campaign called I Will Take Action. And so there is a website, iwilltakeaction.com. I think there's 4 different fact sheets around cover crops. The one of interest today, there is one that focuses in on cover crop termination.
That is found simply at iwilltakeaction, all one word, .com. Great website for information on this topic. But, Sarah, you'd like producers to be thinking in this direction right now, as opposed to 2 or 3 months from now.
Prior planning prevents poor performance, Eric. So definitely need to be thinking about, how they're going to work this particular management need into their overall calendar as we get closer to the busy season of planting.
And Sarah, always a pleasure. We'll have you back soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric.
Weed Management Specialist Sarah Lancaster of K-State Research and Extension. We'll be back with more for you in a moment on Agriculture Today. We're around to time now on Agriculture Today to pick up on the Kansas agricultural weather scene. And accompanying us once more is Chip Redmond, meteorologist, K-State Research and Extension. Chip, let's begin with the sharp, cold weather that checked in Kansas this past week. Probably not record lows, but combined with the wind chill, awfully frigid out there.
Yeah, especially when we're, got a little accommodated to luxurious warm temperatures over the last few weeks. It definitely feels drastic. Not record cold by any means. We're about 5 to 10 degrees away from the record lows this time of year. And thankfully, it's going to be relatively short-lived, and we got a little bit of moisture out of it as well.
How much moisture, though? That was fairly spare, wasn't it?
Yeah, not much, but we got some. We had very, very light amounts of snow across most of the state, less than an inch for most folks, and really barely measurable in places. But at this point, we'll take anything. Typically, when we have a really strong cold front, we would see a dynamic system with copious amounts of moisture, but that strong cold front keeps pushing that moisture to our south and southeast and benefiting the same people and keeping us high and dry, unfortunately.
Okay. So just to be official about it, the drought monitor for this week probably did not improve. It might have worsened.
Yes, it definitely worsened. We added a severe drought for northern Raleigh County to Clay Center to Belleville, and then all the way over to Marysville and then to the Nebraska border. So north central Kansas saw decreasing and degrading drought conditions once again for another week. We did have a little area of a tiny improvement down in Sumner County where they had heavy snow 2 weeks ago. That adjustment finally got made where they had about twice as much as their weekly precipitation there. Other than that, it's continued degradation. We really need a rain event.
We will leave behind these Arctic-like temperatures into a pretty substantial warm-up come next week, right?
Yeah, we start our gradual warm-up trend is already starting to begin. We're not as cold as we were 2 days ago, and then we're going to keep climbing into the weekend, and then into next week, temperature is going to go above normal. We'll see temperatures in the 50 to 60 range by midweek next week. Unfortunately, with warming temperatures this time of year, we just get wind. You get a lot of wind. And so it looks like wind starts picking up again mid-next week. We could have several days of high fire danger until the next cold front comes through with little to no moisture. And we're cool off for a couple days, but overall, it looks like March is going to end up being above average. The Climate Prediction Center favors above average temperatures statewide. And then precipitation-wise, they have the area of the precip maximum in the Ohio Valley starting to shift a little bit west, not quite getting to Kansas, but keeps eastern Kansas in that equal chances of above or below or average precipitation. But western Kansas still continues to be favored for below normal precipitation through March. There's a glimmer of hope maybe at the end of next week when we bring that cold front through, maybe some moisture in the east, but as for widespread precipitation, there's really nothing on our radar for the next 1 to 2 weeks. You know, this time of year, our average precipitation each week is climbing to get into spring. And so, you know, every week we don't get moisture, we see a growing deficit. And then when we add a little bit of warmer temperatures with it, we can really increase demands for moisture across the state.
Well, we'd like to see La Nina give up the ghost. No indications of that happening yet, Chip.
It's still projected by April to May to start warming up, becoming more neutral in the eastern Pacific, which would bring a neutral ENSO to pull us out of La Nina. It's just a matter of when and what other impacts it brings along with it.
Chip, thank you, and we'll catch up with you again next Friday.
Yes, hopefully more optimistic.
Let's hope for that. Chip Redmond, meteorologist, K-State Research and Extension on Kansas agricultural weather. And our time's away once more. We appreciate you tuning in. Please rejoin us on Monday. Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.